there's the iron cross steps. These are brand new steps, so I will scuff them up and re-bedline them when I do the front bumper and some other accent pieces. So on the inside of the cab, this seat here is out of an H2 Hummer. A couple months ago, I drove a buddy of mine's H2 Hummer, and I've been keeping my eye out for seats for this Dodge, but I had to find something that had this belt coming out of the shoulder. And so, not a fan of the Hummer in particular, but the seat was kick-ass comfortable. It adjusts every which way. It's heated. And so I ordered a used set offline, and I've got this one here mounted. I think that they look awesome, and I'm pretty stoked about that. So I've got to get the passenger side in. The wiring, on the other hand, if anybody out there knows the wiring on these things, I'd really love to have help on that, because that so far has been a pain in my ass. But on the inside, we've got odometer gauges all the way around. In one of my Peterbilts, I replaced all of the gauges with a company called Teletech, and it's a digital gauge, and each gauge comes with the sending unit and the wiring. The wiring is kind of interesting because it looks like the old telephone cords, so it just plugs into the back of the gauge once you have it all hooked up and ready to go. And they're super slick. They're really crisp and nice to look at. I may end up switching everything out in this truck to the Teletech. Time will tell on that. They are expensive. So, but the nice thing with them is, like, for example, your air gauge, because they make them for semis, they have a split gauge. So the top number will show you for, say, your tank pressure, and then the number below that will tell you what your say your airbags are set at. And so it's a pretty slick setup there. But I really do like them. But like I said, I think to do my Peterbilt was about $3,800 roughly. That's a lot of gauges, but that it was expensive. So just more pictures or video of the Duraback. This here is the 55 gallon freshwater tank. This is a custom tank made by a company called Miller. And it's a super nice tank. It's got baffles in it, which is something that I specifically wanted. That way I don't get that sloshing side to side when you're going down the road, just to create an unstable ride. And so it's got baffles in it. They plumb it up and put in your fittings, exactly where you want it. You draw a picture, and it's a really nice product. They're all CNC cut, and they're all plastic welded. So it's a custom tank. They're very expensive, but I hope in the long run it'll be well worth the money. So I've got it all framed in and foamed in, as well as belted in. That's 2-inch straps that are bolted directly to where the factory rear seat belt bolts are, and then I reinforced them at the front underneath to bolt that down. And that's just for safety reasons. If we were ever to tip over, or in a collision of some sort, to keep that tank from coming loose and killing us, because without a doubt it definitely would. So you can see I've got my plumbing set up here. This is the suction line that goes inside the camper. You got your vent line, and then you've got your water fill. And that water fill is right here on the outside. And it even says water. And I'm curious, you'll have to kind of let me know how this video turns out, if it's as good or better than GoPro. My GoPro kind of started acting up, and so I got frustrated and decided I was going to try something different. But so you can see up in here we're playing more with the foam. Everything is foamed. So this is 2 layers of metal here. There's an air gap, used to be an air gap, between this sheet of metal and your actual roof. And so I just drilled holes, and I filled that whole thing with foam. And just hoping that you get that reverberation of sound and vibration through those, it almost echoes through those layers of metal like that. So I think that I can really cut down on the decibels on the sound of this thing. So only, like I said, I've done it to a couple of my Pete's before, and I think that, and it worked good on them, so I think it'll be a good setup here. So, all right, coming back here to the back of the rig. On the back of the cab, you can see where I welded in these metal blanks here. And so basically is what that's for is once the camper is mounted on the frame and it's up against, you know, close to the back of this cab, then I will cut out, and you'll see on the front of the camper once we get there, you'll see how there's a big oval opening because it's a complete pass-through. Once it's mated up, it's completely pass-through. So this here will be cut. It'll end up coming down right about in here. It ends up coming down right above, comes right down through here, and then right above the tank. And it'll mainly be for the dogs to get back and forth, but also it helps with your temperature. You know, it keeps everything more moderate between the cab of the pickup and the camper, and then while you're traveling down the road, then it kind of helps that temperature as well. So you don't have a freezing cold camper or a boiling hot camper. It can kind of share some of that air. So back here on the back of the beast, I did a lot of work back here. First thing I did was drag it in here and scuff this whole frame down. Like I said, it was virtually a rust-free frame and body, but of course there was some rust on it. So got everything knocked down and treated, and then I painted it. The product that I used to paint it is this Rust-Oleum Farm and Implement, and they sell this also in a gallon can that you can roll on. And then I just use the aerosol for catching little corners and tight areas that I can't get to with a roller. The cool thing about it, it's not as strong as powder coat. I'm not even saying that, but the cool thing about it is it almost self-levels itself. And when it does, it looks like powder coat. Excuse me, it looks like powder coating, but it's not as strong as powder coating. I have hit it with, you know, other metal and stuff and put nicks and stuff in it, but you can see I've got all my wiring kind of laid out, getting everything plumbed in. When we get to the other side of the truck, I'll show you the Hydronics and the Urthworm unit, and this is kind of wiring that I've got stretched out, kind of get it prepared for when I set that RV body on this truck. Then my wiring's kind of set where it needs to be, so that way I can get it pushed up into the body and finish plumbing the wiring in. Speaking of the Hydronics and the Urthworm, this is the fuel sending unit on this. This is a 60-gallon fuel tank. Let me back up and talk about that for a minute. This thing is awesome. It's made by a company called Ameritank, and I've had it on here now for about 3 years, I believe, and it is awesome to not have to worry about heading out and hitting those miles and not stopping at every other town on your trip. So the reason I upgraded to this is because if you remember, everything in this camper is going to be fired on diesel fuel or solar, but it's going to be completely off-grid. So with that being said, these two ports right here are pickup tubes that feed the Airtronics and the Hydronics diesel-fired heaters. And I'll show you those here in a few minutes, but that's what these two ports are here, is the pickup tubes for that fuel supply. And I do have the FASS. I mentioned that earlier. I've got the FASS fuel system on this, so it's all oversized lines and all that good stuff. But the down here, I redid as much of the back end as I could. I redid all of the brake cables, and the main reason for that was because I was installing the disc brakes. So that is that's a company called EGR, and that's a disc conversion kit. The 01 was the last year where they were doing drum brakes on these trucks. So I want excuse me, I want to get rid of the drum brakes, go with disc. Better cooling, better stopping. You know the spill on that. So, was another benchmark product for install, fit, and finish. The EGR system was perfect. Through the same company, which is a company called Circle Track Racing, is also where I ordered these cables from. I sent them a detailed drawing on exactly how I wanted those measured and built. And I'll be damned if they didn't come in like an inch and a half too short. Their fix for that was taking 1/2 inch conduit and spacing these cables out. And I just shook my head and I mean, whatever. So I just built a plate. I just built a spacer, spaced those cables out, and everything's fine. But I didn't spend $80 per cable to have an inch and a half short on me. I was pretty frustrated about that, but it is what it is again. So I've got these traction arms on this truck. I've had these on here also for 2 or 3 years now. Really a good quality. This is a company on eBay called Spohn, if I'm pronouncing it right. I think it's S-P-O-H-N. And they use spherical ball ends. And it was just a nice kit, and it installed nice, and they work great. You don't get that rear axle hop. They work really good, so I've been happy with those. And down here, I went with the heavy-duty Hellwig rear sway bar. That puts that sway bar really close to the same diameter spec of the front sway bar, so which is quite a bit bigger than factory. And to have that extra control with this much weight, I wanted to make sure to take care of all of those components. I replaced the rear spring pack with a 8-spring spring pack, as well as the shackles. And then we've got Firestone bags here. The biggest thing I didn't want to have a problem with is blow an airbag out and the factory springs not being able to handle that load, and then you're sitting down on your tires and you're not going anywhere. So with the factory suspension, they try to make everything ride like a car, and so it basically had helper springs that came up on the top of the pack. They came up and angled upwards, and so you had these stops up here, and when it hits those stops, and that's when it applies that. Well, I didn't figure I'd probably have enough travel with the airbags that it was ever any good, so I think it was just kind of a pointless, worthless setup to have. So anyway, I changed that out to get the extra capacity. I wanted all the bushings and shackles and everything new back here anyway. So did that, took care of it, and plumb happy with that. Back here, what else do we got going on? I do have the AFE rear diff cover. That's something I think I'm going to change out. If you ever get a chance and you're into this type of building and stuff, watch Gale Banks from Banks Power. Watch his video on the rear diff covers. And what he says and what he talks about is something I've always thought about, but he proves it, and with their testing and stuff, of why the manufacturers use kind of the dish-shaped differential covers for that fluid transfer and stuff. I will be changing that cover out. Those big square covers on these diffs are worthless, and if you watch that video, you'll see exactly why. I highly recommend that video. That guy is sharp. But so over on this side, like I said, I'm still waiting for the Fox shocks. I'm hoping to get those here in a couple weeks. Been kind of frustrating waiting so long, but it is what it is. Here's the 5-gallon air tank. And then, like I said, that'll also have auxiliary air that's plumbed in to the back of the rig, so that way you can fill tires and do whatever else you need to do. That gray box right there is the Hydronics unit, and that's made by a company called Eberspacher. For short, they call themselves S-Bar. This is something that's used in the big truck industry for preheating engines and that type of thing. But the RV industry over the last few years has really picked up on these systems because you can do so much with them, and they're so versatile to do so many different things. So I'll kind of do somewhat of a quick rundown on what they do and how they work. So there's a diesel-fired heater that sits inside that box, and a water pump, and it's what it does is it pumps coolant from one of those ports, and it goes all the way up, and it goes through the engine block, and then comes back, and on its way back, it goes through heat exchangers, and this is what it does in RVs, and this is exactly what I'm doing with it. So a heat exchanger is a prime example that we all know of is a heater core in your car. That's exactly what a heat exchanger is. You got hot coolant that goes into copper tubing, and there's a bunch of aluminum fins, and there's a fan, and that fan blows through those fins, and it pushes that, and it gives you that hot air. So that's what a heat exchanger is. So that's exactly what I'll do with this. So it'll circulate up through the engine block, and it'll come back. It'll go through one heat exchanger up in this corner of the camper, and I'll show you. It's underneath my refrigerator. When we look at that point, then you'll notice what I'm talking about. But it'll go through that heat exchanger, and then it'll come out of there, and it'll go through this water heater. This is a liquid to liquid heat exchanger. So the coolant basically flows through one side, and then your fresh water flows through the other side. So every time you turn that tap on, as long as that coolant is flowing hot, then you have on-demand hot water. There's no need for your water heater tanks. It just takes up so much space. This unit will be mounted underneath right in between those mounts there. It'll be mounted on the outside, and that gives you instant on-demand hot water. And the way that they do that is there's a series of brass plates in here, and that hot water passes through there at, say, 180 degrees. And so when your coolant or your fresh water comes through there, it steals that heat from the coolant plates and gets that water hot, and it comes right out of your tap hot. So you don't have that big delay. You don't have all that storage, extra space taken up by water tanks and that type of thing. I think it's going to be pretty slick. I've never built a system like this before, but it completely makes sense on how it's going to work. Awesome. So I'm pretty excited about trying that. But and then it just continually circulates coolant. So the other advantage with that is is when you're driving down the road and your engine is running, then the water pump is also going to circulate that same fluid through that system. So when you're going down the road, you have heat in your RV, and then when you get to your destination and you shut that engine off, then you immediately fire up the hydronics unit, and now it just has to maintain that temperature, and it's going to circulate that hot coolant all the way through the system as well. So I think it's going to work really, really good. Right here in the frame rails, you can see this is the fuel pumps for the two different units. Which brings me to the next item. This is the wiring back here for what they call Urthtronics. And Urthtronics is a diesel-fired heater that has a fan that blows across basically a radiator, and that delivers hot air. And so it's overkill, yes, because I have a heater already on this side, but it's just a backup system. I'll use them both just to kind of keep the cab and RV nice and comfortable. But you hear people make the comment that, well, I'd rather live in the cold climate because you can always put more clothes on, but you can't take enough off, in Florida where it's super hot. Well, I beg to differ. When it's 20 or 30 below zero, you can't put enough clothes on to stay warm. So I'd rather have a backup heater and know that I'm not going to freeze my ass off than to have one heater fail, and that's the only heater I've got. So those two units bought together is the newer series. And so ultimately those units plug into each other through the controller, and that gives they talk to each other, so that way there's no, they're not fighting each other on temperature and that type of thing. So pretty cool system. It's a little complex to wire it and plumb it, but I think ultimately at the end of the day it's gonna be pretty sweet system. So yeah, back to the quieting of the diesel engine. I added a resonator to the exhaust. That's 4-inch exhaust, and then I added a large muffler here, and then back at the back of the unit, coming out of the rear bumper, will be another muffler back there. So keep in mind, this frame is this truck is an 8-foot box from the factory. The camper body, the main base of the camper, is 10 feet. So I'm 2 feet longer than the factory box. So I do have quite a bit of space up underneath there to where I'll be able to have more accessories and not rob my precious storage compartments. So kind of back over here inside the truck, I also built this center console or control panel. I've got a Samsung tablet here for Onyx mapping, as well as my Smarty tuner. And then that's one of the controllers for that S-bar, those S-bar heaters I was just showing you about. And so there will be a controller in the cab, and then there will be a controller also in